The laughter started the moment the first block of ice slid across the dirt. I remember the exact sound it made. A slow scraping, like a saw dragging across bone. It echoed across the small clearing beside my cabin, and the men standing near the fence burst into quiet, amused chuckles. I didn't look up. Instead, I leaned my shoulder harder into the ice block and shoved again. The frozen slab crept forward another inch toward the pit I had been digging all spring. Behind me, one of the settlers cleared his throat. "Well now," he said, his voice thick with humor. "Never seen anyone store winter before it even arrives." More laughter followed. I kept pushing. The ice had come from the river 3 miles north. In early spring, before the thaw finished its work, thick plates of ice still floated along the banks. I'd spent weeks hauling them back on a sled, one miserable trip after another. Some of the men had watched me the first day. By the third day, they'd started making jokes. By the 10th, they'd brought friends. Now half the village of Hollow Creek had heard about the widow trying to freeze summer. The slabs slid into place beside the others, forming a growing wall of clear, glittering ice inside the deep pit. I stepped back, breathing hard, wiping sweat and melting frost from my hands. Mr. Granger leaned against the split-rail fence, chewing tobacco and studying the pit like it was the most amusing spectacle he'd seen in years. "You planning to open a winter storehouse, Mrs. Hale?" he asked. I brushed dirt from my skirt. "No," I said calmly. "I'm planning to survive." That earned another round of laughter. Granger spat into the dust. "Survive what?" "Summer." The other men chuckled. I didn't answer. Instead, I climbed down into the pit and began covering the ice blocks with a thick layer of sawdust. The sawdust was important. It would keep the ice from melting too quickly once the heat came. It had taken weeks to collect enough from the mill. The pit itself was nearly 8 feet deep, carved directly into the shaded side of the hill beside my cabin. The ground here stayed cold even in July. When the ice was packed tightly and insulated with sawdust, the cold would last months. Long enough, if I was careful. Long enough to keep food frozen through summer, and maybe even through winter. Granger hopped the fence and walked closer, peering down into the pit. "You gone strange since Tom died," he said. The name hit like a dull hammer. Tom Hale had been my husband. He'd built the cabin behind me with his own hands 3 years earlier when Hollow Creek was still just a handful of hopeful settlers. Then last winter had come early, and it had taken him with it. Fever, pneumonia, and a storm that kept the doctor trapped across the mountains. By the time help arrived, Tom was already buried beneath the frozen ground. I climbed out of the pit and picked up the next ice block. The men watched as I dragged it toward the hole. "You're wasting time," Granger said. "Maybe. You could be growing crops. Maybe. You could be trapping. Maybe." I slid the ice into place with a solid thud. Then I stood and looked directly at him. "But I'm doing this instead." For a moment he said nothing. Then he shrugged. "Well," he said, "a body's got to entertain themselves somehow." The men wandered off after that. Their laughter drifted away with them down the dusty road toward town. I waited until they were gone before I let myself lean against the pit wall and breathe. The truth was, the idea had started as desperation. Tom and I had nearly starved during our first winter in Hollow Creek. Supply wagons rarely made it through the mountain passes once snow began to fall. The town depended on shipments of flour, dried meat, and tools from the railhead 200 miles away. When storms closed the roads, the valley was alone. And last winter had nearly killed us. Now Tom was gone. But the memory of that hunger stayed sharp. So when spring arrived and I saw the river still choked with ice, an idea formed. If the cold could kill us, maybe it could save us too. That summer became a blur of work. I hauled ice until my hands bled. I dug the pit deeper. I reinforced its walls with timber. I packed the ice tighter with every trip. Then came the food. I began storing everything I could freeze. Fish from the river, venison from the forest, berries, vegetables, even milk sealed inside tin containers. The pit slowly transformed into a hidden vault of cold beneath the hill. And every week, someone came by to laugh. The widow freezing food. The strangest idea in Hollow Creek. One afternoon, old Mr. Caldwell stopped his wagon beside my fence. He climbed down slowly, his joints stiff from years of farming. "You serious about this?" he asked. I nodded. "Yes." He studied the pit for a long time. Then he scratched his beard thoughtfully. "You expecting a bad winter?" "I'm expecting winter," I said. He grunted quietly. That was the only man in the entire village who didn't laugh. By late August, the ice pit was nearly full. Layers of ice, layers of food, packed carefully beneath sawdust and earth. The temperature down there stayed cold enough that your breath fogged in the air. I tested it one evening by placing a fresh fish near the bottom. 3 days later, it was still frozen solid. That night, I allowed myself a small smile. The system worked. Above the pit, I built a thick wooden lid covered with packed dirt and straw. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a mound beside my cabin. But beneath it lay nearly 6 months of food, more than I had ever owned before. The village harvest came soon after. Fields filled with golden wheat, barns packed with grain, smokehouses heavy with meat. Hollow Creek celebrated like every autumn. There was music at the tavern. Children ran through the streets. Men bragged about how strong their cattle had grown. And more than once, someone raised a glass to joke about the widow with her frozen food. I didn't mind. Let them laugh. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow fell in October. At first it was light, almost beautiful, thin white powder drifting across the valley. Then November came, and the storms followed. The first blizzard lasted 3 days. Wind howled through the valley like something alive. Snow piled against doors and windows. When the storm finally cleared, the town looked like it had been buried. But life went on. People dug out their barns. They shoveled their roofs. And the supply wagons still arrived. For a while, then the second storm hit. This one was worse. The mountain pass vanished beneath 10 feet of snow. The wagons stopped coming. Still, the town wasn't worried. They had plenty of food stored. Or so they thought. Then December arrived. And with it came the storm that changed everything. The sky turned dark green just before it started. I remember standing at my cabin window, watching clouds swallow the mountains. The wind rose slowly at first, then faster. Snow began to fall. Heavy wet snow. Not the soft powder Hollow Creek was used to. This snow clung to everything. Roofs, trees, barn beams. Hour by hour, the weight grew heavier. That night I heard the first roof collapse. A loud cracking sound somewhere down in the village. Then another, and another. By morning, the storm had become something terrifying. Snow fell without stopping, and the wind drove it sideways across the valley. The world disappeared into white. From my cabin window, I could barely see 20 feet. But one thing I knew for certain. The supply road through the mountains was gone. Completely gone. Hollow Creek was cut off. And winter had only just begun. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside into the roaring storm. Snow already covered the ground halfway to my knees. The wind bit at my face like knives. But I didn't go toward town. Instead, I walked toward the mound beside my cabin. The one everyone had laughed about all summer. I brushed snow from the wooden lid and lifted it open. Cold air rushed upward from the pit. Deep, frozen air. Inside the darkness, rows of preserved food sat buried in ice. Enough to last months. For the first time since the storm began, I felt calm. Because down in the village, people were about to discover something. Their barns were collapsing. Their smokehouses were buried. And the roads were sealed shut by snow. Sooner or later, Hollow Creek would realize the truth. Winter wasn't just visiting. It had trapped them. And when their food started running out, they would remember the widow who froze summer. And they would come knocking. For 3 days the storm did not stop. Snow fell so thick it erased the world beyond my cabin. The wind screamed down the valley like a living thing, shaking the trees and rattling the shutters on my windows. I spent those days working. Not worrying. Working. Each morning I checked the ice pit. The cold inside held perfectly. The fish, venison, and berries remained solid as stone. I removed only what I needed for the day, then sealed the pit again beneath its heavy lid and thick blanket of straw. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled steadily. Outside, Hollow Creek was fighting for its life. On the 4th morning, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was almost frightening. I stepped outside and looked toward the village. The valley had become a frozen ocean. Snowdrifts rose higher than fences. Several rooftops sagged dangerously beneath the weight. One barn had collapsed completely, its beams sticking out of the snow like broken bones. I wasn't surprised. Wet snow was heavy, too heavy for the barns most settlers had built. By afternoon, thin columns of smoke rose weakly from the remaining chimneys. People were digging out, but I could already see the problem. The smokehouses were buried. The livestock pens had collapsed. and the supply wagons that normally arrived every 2 weeks were nowhere in sight. The mountain pass would be sealed for months. The realization spread through Hollow Creek slowly. At first, people believed the road would reopen soon. Then the second week passed. Then the third. And the snow kept falling. Not as violently as before, but enough to keep the valley sealed shut. Food began disappearing quickly. Cattle had died in the collapsed barns. Grain stores had been ruined by snowmelt. Traps caught little in the frozen forest. The laughter about my ice pit vanished. By mid-January, the first man climbed the hill to my cabin. It was Mr. Caldwell. The old farmer moved slowly through the deep snow, leaning heavily on a walking stick. When he reached the fence, he removed his hat. "I reckon you knew," he said quietly. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I lifted the lid of the pit and let him see inside. Rows of frozen meat, berries, vegetables, fish packed in clear ice. Cold air spilled upward like breath from the earth itself. Caldwell stared for a long time. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. That evening, more visitors came. Then more the next day. Soon half the town stood in my yard. Their faces looked thinner, colder, and none of them laughed. Mr. Granger stepped forward finally. The same man who had mocked me all summer. His coat hung loose around his shoulders now. His beard was covered with frost. "You got food," he said bluntly. "Yes." "How much?" "Enough." Silence spread across the yard. Everyone understood what that meant. Without the supply road, Hollow Creek could run out of food before spring. I looked across the crowd. Men who had laughed. Women who had watched from windows. Children who now clung to their parents' coats against the cold. Then I spoke. "I'll sell it." Murmurs rippled through the group. Granger frowned. "Sell?" "Yes." I rested my hand on the frozen lid. "You bring firewood, or labor, or tools, whatever you have left." The wind stirred lightly across the valley. "This food feeds the town," I said. "But nobody takes it for free." Caldwell nodded slowly. "A fair trade," he said. And that was how Hollow Creek survived the winter. Every morning people climbed the hill to my cabin. Some carried firewood. Some repaired the damaged fences around my land. Others helped expand the ice pit so it could store even more food the following year. Piece by piece, the frozen stores beneath the hill kept the town alive. No one laughed anymore. By spring, the snow finally melted. The supply wagons returned. But something in Hollow Creek had changed. The settlers no longer mocked strange ideas. And every summer after that, when the river ice broke along its banks, the entire town helped haul the frozen blocks back to the hill. Because they all remembered the winter when the valley was cut off. And the widow who had frozen summers saved them all.